Thank you very much.
So as we sort of said in the introductory talk, this is a very important celebratory moment for us because it's the first time in 2 years that we're doing a live seminar. And I'm really delighted to have Chris West here with us today for this occasion. Chris and I have known each other for, we just established, over a decade. And I don't think that there is a better advocate for the importance of understanding how language works in industry than Chris. So I'm delighted to have him here today to talk to us about what is happening to brand language. Chris, I mean, you've seen the abstract, and I'm going to have to read this because I can't remember all your credentials. But Chris is the CEO and founding partner of Verbal Identity. Correct me if I say anything wrong, which is a successful strategic branding agency specializing in basically harnessing the power of language to transform the way companies talk. And so Verbal Identity provides analysis, training, creative services to brands like LVMH, John Lewis, Christie's, Rightmove, B&Q, and many, many more.
That's correct, all correct. So
fantastic. He's also a multi-award-winning copywriter, so he really does come from the creative side of things. He's got a book out, Strong Language, which apparently, I didn't know this, hit #1 on Amazon in the first 36 hours after release. We can only dream of that in academia. And if that wasn't enough, I just discovered that you also wrote a film.
Yes.
Which won a short film, which won best film at the Barcelona Film Festival. So he really is into language, and I don't think that there is a better person to tell us about what is happening to brand language currently. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much. Zsofia, how long officially have we got?
50 minutes.
50 minutes. Okay.
Questions.
Thank you. I'm going to do a bit of analysis straight away, which is if I'm standing up and you're sitting down, you imagine me to talk and you to listen, and me to know something and you to learn. I feel like I know my little world of industry and language in industry. And for me, the interesting part of this will be when I stop talking and you start talking. And I don't know where the camera is, but I'll look for people in the who are joining remotely as well when you start asking questions. So I will do my very best not to talk all wall to wall for the 15 minutes, but hopefully stop short with about 10 minutes. So you can ask some questions and say, why on earth, Chris, did you think that? That's clearly rubbish. We learned that years ago, or something else, if you would like. Would that be okay with you? And with all of our remote participants as well. Thank you very much. So this certainly won't be me talking about highly technical parts of linguistics. That's really because I have far less teaching and learning in and knowledge of linguistics than you do. But I hope that the small amount of linguistics that I have learned has informed what I've done in industry. And I can just share some of what's going on in that world. And it's through my own particular slant and through my own company's kind of clients that we find. So it's certainly not a general overview, but I'll talk a little bit about what I think works well in language in the industry branding world, and then talk a little bit about what I've seen happen over the last 2 years with brand language. So just to set a base level, if you like, when I talk about brand, I might talk about it without really qualifying it. So what I would like to say about a brand is, well, we have an expression which is no brand, no margin, which is that really anything that a company does today, another company can copy and start doing tomorrow. And often the difference is the brand, the story, the reason that people believe in this company beyond its pure functional delivery of products. So that's what I mean about brand. And when we say no brand, no margin, or no story, no margin, what I think we mean is that when you invest language into, when you invest in language, and when you consider your language carefully, then you are building a sense of the business bigger than just its pure functionality. That's what I mean about brand. That's why I personally think that language is a marvelously brilliant thing to help us all build businesses and convey what businesses are about. So broadly, what's happening, what is brand language, what we see work, and what is happening in brand language, what's happened over the last 2 years. There are 150, what would be the worst thing I could do now would be read off the screen, and I will desperately try and not do that. But there is a couple of stats at the beginning which I would like to share with you. One is that I think there are 115 million companies in the world today, and certainly we may only have seen a very, very small portion of those. But of those companies we have seen, how many have ever said anything that you can remember even 2 minutes later? So we know that Netflix, it's certain parts of Netflix language has entered into culture. And if, like me, you're a dairy dodger and you don't have milk in your coffee in the morning, you might have oat milk. And if you have oat milk, then perhaps you've used the Oatly brand, and you might have sat at the breakfast table and read the back of the pack and been engaged by their language. Normally, if I run a workshop with our clients, then there's only 2-3 companies whose language anyone can ever remember, and they would be typically Netflix, Oatly, and sometimes Tesla. So really the question is, what's going on with all these companies around the world? Someone is carefully considering language, and they're asking people in their team, or they're doing it themselves, they're writing lots of language, yet this language isn't remembered. It's having no impact at all. So what is it that makes language work? And for fun rather than for science, I made a spectrum of how effective I think language is. But before I go there, just a note from the world of industry. As Zsofia said, I come from the world of advertising. So if you're in the world of advertising, which is very solipsistic, it does think it's at the center of the marketing client's world, then you will think that all marketing is advertising. And that has spilt over into client's mentality to a certain extent. But then we will say, how many different ways do you think language is working for your business? Do you think we can get to 12? And normally we'll get to about 50 within 2 or 3 minutes. So it's not just advertising, which is where I came from. If you are a business and you are at a trade event, what is it that you say that conveys not just the idea about your business, but tries to convey something of create a relationship? Then you might have a customer service department. If you're a one-person solopreneur, you are the customer service department, as well as the person that turns off the lights at night and washes up the coffee mug. But if you have a dedicated customer service, are they talking about your business in the same way that you talk about your business, referring to Zsofia's quick reminder of the different ways in which you can analyze something? You know, are they using the same genre? Are they using the same metaphors? Are they creating the same kind of rapport? Even signage in a building. I live in Oxford now. I have a friend in Oxford whose job is quite niche. He is responsible for producing signs for offices and installing them. That's his whole career. So if you think about it, the signs that you have up around UCL and in this building really tell you something about what UCL thinks of you, the position of authority it might take, how it's going to ask you to obey the rules. So for a corporate business as well, the language they use in their signage around the building tells a certain story. Just as it does if the CEO stands up, if they do some kind of customer event. There is a big challenge for every business we're talking to at the moment, which is to be able to recruit the right number and the right kind of people into their business. So the language they use, and we worked on this with one of Alphabet's companies in Silicon Valley. The language that you use in recruitment is critical really for the health of the future of your business. Because if you hire the wrong people, then your business isn't going to move as fast or do as well as you hope it would do. So through this screen, if you can't see this screen, there are many other ways that language engages and plays a role in industry. How do you engage what's the language you use when you engage your partners, your retailers, your distributors? If you have a brand ambassador, are they saying the right thing on social media? You are dependent largely when you're a business on your agencies, your suppliers, whatever you call them. And when you brief them, and Zsofia, I didn't realize how much what you told me has stuck in my mind, or, you know, when you tutored me 11 years ago. So even this thing about, I've been talking to clients recently about how you talk, the metaphors you use to talk about your business when you brief your agencies, that will definitely construct an understanding in their mind of what you are and what you expect as a business. So thank you very much. In many, many different ways, you're using language through as a business. So what makes language work? I think at the worst end of this spectrum of how language is working is the person who stands up or writes and is in some way overwhelmed by the burden of knowledge that they have to convey. For me personally, the worst moment in my learning career, if you like, was when I studied computer science as a postgrad, and the computer science lecturer came into the lecture theatre, handed out a deck of notes to everyone, took his notes, and he spent 50 minutes writing the notes up on the board. At the end of 50 minutes, he left. There was nothing in his language which really conveyed any of the thinking behind the information. His presence in the room was largely wasted. And I reflect on that, and I think that was because that person was overwhelmed by the burden of knowledge they had and they wanted to share. And it was, if you could see the results from my postgraduate studies, you would see that it was a highly ineffective way of teaching me in particular. I would say slightly further along from the terrible end of the spectrum are most of the emails we see, perhaps even some of the emails that we write. You see an email and no one's heart jumps with excitement. They go, oh my goodness, this is me another 5 minutes of my life gone reading something. Where are they? What are they trying to say? In the business world, most annual reports are produced, read by a very limited number of people, scrutinized, and then largely perhaps ignored. If you are thinking about moving out into the professional world, you will create, if you haven't done already, a LinkedIn profile. And most LinkedIn profiles, guess what they say? I am a passionate, experienced, da, 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 da. I think LinkedIn found that the single most used word for 3 years in a row was passionate. So if you're thinking of creating a LinkedIn profile and you reach for the word passionate, I would say perhaps think of something else which is more precise. Since we can't all be passionate, it doesn't seem believable. If you sign up for newsletters, if you've signed up for it, the language is probably better. And I will say I do have a newsletter and I choose not to call it a newsletter. I haven't worked out what I should call it, but it sounds so boring if I call it a newsletter. There are some very brilliant and talented people in advertising, and I think that they produce copy which is further along the spectrum, but it's still not great. I think at the far end of the spectrum, to where things are really good, that advertising and website copy that actually engages you and tells you not just what they're saying, but some sense of the business behind it. I think that's quite rare, but I think it is very impactful. For me, one of those companies is Reformation. And I like to say that you may not know this about me, but I choose not to wear women's clothing, but I choose to subscribe to a women's clothing newsletter because I think the language is so good. And what is it about this website advertising newsletter copy, which is good? And for me, it's the fact that they show some real understanding. There's a connection. I know, you now know that I know that you know. That is what I think is going on. That many of us would have attended a wedding in the summer, and we know that we've sat there, and my goodness, it's gone on, worse than me talking. And actually what you want is for a little bit of stretch in that thing that you're wearing, or as it says for the Emerson dress below, make sure the dress is still looking cute when you've had a few too many. For me, that's 10, 12 words, but it builds empathy. And I think it really shows something wonderful about the writer and their expectation of the reader. So that, I think, is heading us towards better copy, more engaging language. And I think at the heart of that is this idea that humanity wins. That actually when copy comes alive, when language comes alive from a business, it is because it feels human, yes, but it feels like it has some real sense of humanity above corporate life. A very successful book, I think it's still in print, is Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. I don't know if any of you, has anyone here read it? Has anyone here heard of the book? The book has a kind of legendary status. And one of the things he said was, seek to understand people before you ask them to understand you. So this hugely successful book, which I think was written in the 40s and is still in print, one of the core things there is humanity wins. Try and understand someone, humanity wins. So I think that's what's going on. When we see language which is memorable, which is better, which does tell us something, which does engage us, I think that's what's going on here is this sense of humanity. I mentioned annual reports, and most people outside of the financial world wouldn't choose to read an annual report, with one exception, which is Berkshire Hathaway's annual report, written by, well, the chairman is Warren Buffett, one of the most financially successful investors. He has a personal brand, which is this kind of folksy wisdom. And it's very interesting that he is able to use language in his annual report, which even makes a virtue of the mistakes they've made. So rather than saying, you know, we screwed up or just sweeping something under the carpet, he is using this sense of folksy wisdom, folksy humor to say, as is the case in marriage, business acquisitions often deliver surprises after the I do. It's really interesting how he is skillfully using language to make a virtue of his mistake. And again, I think it's because he understands that he is a human writing for one other human to consume that writing and trying to build this bridge of humanity. We see that banks sometimes forget that, and I think some of the more traditional banks are least successful in creating this sense of humanity. They might do it visually, here's him and her, having a glass of wine at the local, but then there are 60 words. Yet some of the newer companies are much more direct. And they just say, look, get more from your money. It seems much more like how I would speak to you if I was talking to you about why my Revolut card is a good idea. So again, it's this thing of humanity wins. I found it really interesting that Apple has, I'm not sure exactly when we put these figures down on a slide, but Apple had 6 million followers, Microsoft had almost 14 million followers. Yet, Tim Cook has twice as many followers as Apple does, and Bill Gates has 2 or 3 times as many followers as Microsoft does. And again, I think it's because humanity wins. So what, Chris? Well, it's kind of interesting, perhaps in itself. If you're going to go out into the industrial commercial world afterwards and you're being asked to write or bring language, bring your linguistic skills to bear, maybe one of the things to think about is, are we writing as a corporate with this sense of impermeable rules, which I don't think many people believe in anymore, or are we writing as perhaps a branded version of humanity? So that's what I think is very interesting about language. Over the last couple of years, though, we've seen challenges to how society understands itself, how society operates. And I think that any company that doesn't try and change, particularly any branded company that doesn't try and change when society is changing so much, is really in danger of being seen as fundamentally out of touch. So if there'd just been one massive shock to society over the last 2 or 3 years, that would have been enough, I think, for brand owners to really question, how are we speaking? Are we doing the right thing in our language? So certainly there's been not just one societal shock of COVID, but I think a significant societal shock of Black Lives Matter and a growing awareness of racism, but also climate crisis. And I think all of those things are having what we're seeing now is a huge cost of living crisis for many people. If you're a brand owner, a business owner right now, and you don't think those things have changed society, then I think you're crazy. I think you're kidding yourself. And if you think society's changed and you don't need to change your brand and how your brand turns up in society, then I think you're kidding yourself as well. Some brand owners have been tuned to this, and they've changed how their language works. But before I kind of discuss how I think language has changed, or how some brand language has changed over the last couple of years, I'd like to share the framework that we use at Verbal Identity around how we think brand language works. So if I were to show you a Mini and a Ferrari, and I will say I'm not a car nut by any means, but if I would show you a Mini and a Ferrari, you would, I reckon 100% of us here and tuning in digitally, 100% of us would say, yes, that's the Mini, that's Ferrari, and get it absolutely right. Mini and Ferrari have invested heavily in all of their cues about their identity, their visual cues, especially, you know, a Ferrari definitely looks like that, a Mini looks like this. A Ferrari sounds like that, a Mini sounds like this. They've also invested in their language. So I've anonymized 2 pieces of copy, one from Ferrari, one from Mini. And there's no visual cues here at all. I've chosen the most straightforward font. I've taken out all imagery. There's no brands. I've removed the names. And if I ask you for 10 seconds just to think which is Mini, which is Ferrari, even if you're not car nuts, I'd be very interested to see what you say. We could do a poll, but I think technically I'm not able to bring in the virtual participants. So, and also I'm really worried that if I've said it so clear that half of us will get it wrong. However, no one has ever, literally in doing this for about 6 or 7 years, no one has ever got it wrong. Everyone has been able to say immediately, car on the left is Mini, car on the right is Ferrari. And I will say to you, how do you know that? How do you know that? Just so, what is your forensic linguistic ability that allows you to instantly say that's Mini and instantly say that's Ferrari with such great confidence? And you might say, well, go-kart handling, Mini would never, that's Mini. Or they might say, look, the one on the left, they just seem like a friendly bunch, whereas the people on the right, they just seem like a really technical, engineering, complicated. Or you might say, people on the left are just fun. People on the right, I don't know, they seem elitist. Or someone might say, and there's usually one person in a session of 20 people that say V12, Mini doesn't have a V12. Okay, and I say, well, I trust you on that, I really don't know. So when we run this in a workshop in industry, then we're able to group what people are saying into 3 different categories of response. And then we say, what's behind, you know, what's grouping this set of answers here as one group? What's grouping this? What's grouping that? And as far as we are concerned, a good enough framework, even though it's not been proved in the world of linguistics, a good enough framework is that we think behind any piece of language that we see in industry, there are really 3 levels to the language. There are 3 different things working together to constitute the whole. The first is this, what we would call a 10,000-foot narrative. There's this sense of whoever wrote this had a view of the world. They wanted to create this kind of world. And if they wanted to create this kind of world, they had to stand for this and they had to stand against that. Zsofia was very kind to mention my book. Chapter 7 of my book is called The Nun's Maneuver. Because when we talk to brand owners and we say, look, one of the things that we would like you to be very clear about is what you stand against. The Nun's Maneuver, when I was living in West London, around the corner from us, there was a convent. And the convent, the nuns at the convent wanted to build an extension on the convent. And of course, they had to get planning permission to do that. And I was walking down one of the streets and I saw one of the nuns and she was talking to one of our neighbors. And I overheard what she said. And she said, if you don't support our planning application, you're working for the devil. And I thought, oh my goodness. But she was very clear in their brand and in their language, what they stand for and what they stand against. And so often if we're with a business and they're having difficulty defining themselves, one of the things we'll help them define at this 10,000 foot, this part of this worldview is, let's be really clear what you stand against. And certainly when I mentioned Oatly, the reason why a lot of people engage with Oatly as an oatmeal drink is that they're very clear what they stand against. They are against the dairy industry's impact on climate. Through that, they achieved a $13 billion valuation for what is really oats in water, sold in Tetra Paks, distributed through supermarkets, right next to another brand called Root Health, who achieved an amazing valuation for oats and water in the same packaging, distributed through the same channels. But their valuation was 70 million compared to 13 billion for Oatly. And they were selling a product, I can't taste the difference in the product, distributed in the same pack through the same channels. And Root Health was talking about, well, you should drink oat milk because it's kind of good for yoga or something. I don't know. Yeah, Oatly had created this worldview at 10,000 feet. This is the world we believe in. This is what we stand for, and this is what we stand against. They'd lived that out tonally, just as Mini did. You know, they were fun, they were easygoing people. Ferrari were technicians, engineers, quite severe, quite serious. We can see that Oatly and every other good brand voice has a very strong sense of its own personality, which we would call a 1,000 feet level. And then last of all are what we would call ground level details. And they are the things that really you can literally put your finger on the page. They may be use of jargon. They may be things like sentence length. The shortest sentence length on the Mini's piece of copy is 3 words. And I think it's 20 words on the Ferrari piece of copy. So jargon, sentence length, even grammar. My old grammar teacher at school would say Mini's copy is incorrect because born to corner, that's not a proper sentence. Yet most of us would use that sentence in conversation, and I would suggest therefore is grammatically acceptable. So defining all 3 levels of a brand voice, I think really helps brands and businesses be very clear in differentiating the language about who they are, how they want to be, how they want to be perceived. And that's the framework that we use in industry. It's simple, it seems to help align many different agencies they have, many different writers they will have inside their building and outside, and be easy enough to remember, but still do a hard enough job. So for the last 10 minutes, I'd just perhaps like to cover very quickly, if it's okay with you, what we've seen changing in brand language over the last 2 or 3 years. What we've seen largely is a move towards purpose-driven businesses. Many businesses are talking about their purpose. And so what previously only existed in an annual report is now coming into general consumer-facing language, even into the employee brand. So here's an example from Oatly. Many businesses would have perhaps said our purpose is to do this, and that would have rested only in their annual report. And instead, in their consumer-facing copy, it might well have been quite straightforward. I'm sorry that you can't see the particulars here, but I hope that you'll take my word for it that they are using their views on purpose at 10,000 feet. Oatly is perhaps right to identify the dairy industry as a competitor to them and see their impact on climate. But Brewdog isn't perhaps competing against an industry behemoth which is having damage, which is creating impact on the climate. Yet they still, as part of their worldview, have moved from talking about beer and craft beer to talking about beer that doesn't damage the environment, doesn't damage the climate. Nike, we've seen consistently, although not universally, support people who want to create what I would say is correct societal change. We've seen Ben & Jerry's do that as well. And what's interesting for us is that the research that we see says that consumers, why I think language is really important and why an update of language is overdue for many brands is that consumers want to see brands having a voice and making a stand about important societal matters. This was Burger King saying there are other places to go other than Burger King. But at the same time, as soon as some brands start to do this, other brands will ape it and copy it, perhaps with unsuccessful consequences. So this was a tweet made public, I think, to the Prime Minister from Fraser's Group, which owns one of the big sports outlets. And they said, look, sorry, They did this open tweet to the Prime Minister saying, government Frasers as a group is the leading retailer of sporting and fitness equipment in the UK through the Sports Direct and Evans Cycle. We like confirmation as to whether our Sports Direct and Evans Cycles shops should open in the morning during this COVID crisis. I don't know when this was. This was 2020, March 2020, right? So there is no one there are very few people in the world that believe Sports Direct is here for the good of the planet. And as not me, anyway, this tweeter said, you know, I'm self-isolating and urgently one of those giant mugs and an Under Armour headband. They were, I think, Sports Direct Frasers Group were correctly called out by a few people for self-serving interest. Just as, I think this is a Wetherspoons, just as Wetherspoons were for all of their claims of social right on this, they weren't paying their staff a living wage. I personally found this Tesco very copycat in its approach, just as Burger King had been smart when stores reopened. Tesco did this and said, pop down to your local if you can. Well, yeah, I don't know if that's really true for the heart of Tesco, my personal view. So in summary about this point at the 10,000 foot level, what we're seeing is that those brands which are succeeding, which are getting their language remembered and therefore are engaging consumers, are those which are finding their language to talk about strong morals, not necessarily their politics, and awareness of society. So I hope that perhaps less relevant for this room, but for brand owners out there and business owners out there, what I hope is that they are helping their writers define the 10,000 foot brand narrative, being very clear about what they stand for and equally what they stand against. If we come down a level from that 10,000 foot to where the tonal values are, the personality of the brand language is created. What I think we found is that COVID was extremely difficult for a lot of people. And our heads were quite full of conflicting advice or worry or various other concerns. And I think in that environment, as much as you want your worldview, as much as you want to talk about changing things, that kind of brewdog or Oatly swearing and pointing kind of attitude, kind of personality, isn't always the right way to go about things. Dash, I don't know if any of you know Dash Water. Do you know Dash Water? So their 10,000 foot view may be the same as Oatly's and Brewdog, but they believe that their industry is damaging the climate. And therefore, if you're Brewdog, you think you have to take a very anarchic, confrontational, aggressive, very angry tone of voice, pretty much like Oatly does. Dash, however, have the same 10,000 foot worldview, but at 1,000 foot, their personality, their tonal values are much softer, they're more conciliatory, they're more persuasive, they're more gentle. So although their 10,000 foot worldviews may be the same, at 1,000 foot, they're finding different tonal values. We've seen that this kind of urgency that brands adopted, they're also backing off the call to action. Some are talking quite rightly, we're all in this together, but generally many are talking gently. If any of you know Headspace, I think the language that Headspace uses on their site, it's short of exclamation marks, it's short of a sense of crisis and urgency in order to get you to engage. It is gently persuasive, even though they may say, they may believe that at 10,000 foot, the world desperately needs changing and how we live in the world desperately needs changing. They've managed at the 1,000 feet level to be much more conciliatory, soft. And I think that's they have a really interesting use of language. So what else are we seeing? I think a lot of this language of I get you, you get me, a lot of that started happening in social media channels. And just as purpose has come out of annual reports and landed, I think, in consumer-facing press, so I think this gentler, more human, less perhaps stiffly grammatical way of talking has moved out of social media into the rest of the comms channels. What can brands do? We would always say for brand. I'm skipping over some slides because I'm momentarily bored by them. And if I'm bored, then I can't expect you to be interested. So what can brand owners do? Perhaps one of the things we would always say is look at your writers. Very interestingly, without naming names, we went to a large UK retailer and we said, let's talk about this. I'm not going to say which company it is. In the workshop, I said, I'm not going to say which company it is, but let's talk about their tonal values of their brand voice. And we mentioned before, and they said, everyone in the room said, yeah, that'd be really good. We'd love to write for them. And then we said, okay, well, they are your company's tonal values. So whatever you create, there's always going to be friction or lag or more noise and signal in how those are communicated through and how those are adopted through the organization. So one of the things we say is make sure your writers know and are trained, not just kind of exposed to, but trained on the tonal values. And then look at those tonal values. Are you stuck in a kind of 2019 world view where urgency and grab it and shouty seemed to be a dominant way of talking? Or are you understanding that society has changed and how your brand turns up in society needs to change as well? What's happening with ground level details? Zsofia, perhaps we could talk about this afterwards. I have a view that grammar is a class war. If you are English, British, and you grew up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, you would have had a laugh, probably, or a laugh forced on you about the greengrocer's apostrophe, this thing about, by legend, that a greengrocer will write tomatoes and put an apostrophe before the S. Okay, so we're laughing perhaps at the lack of education or lack of understanding of the working class greengrocer, failing to laugh at the at the middle class bookseller who announces an event with 5 exclamation marks after the announcement on a blackboard outside their shop. I would say that is equally wrong. Yet no one's laughing at the middle class bookseller. And so I do believe that much of what we hear about correct grammar is actually informed by class. And if we're going to move to a more equitable society, then we might choose to have a conversation about how we use grammar and how we police grammar within our organization. Here we are, The Guardian, talking about the greengrocer's apostrophe. And here is, I'm guessing that's Tesco, I don't know. But again, I am, as someone who was taught grammar in the 70s by someone who learnt their grammar before the Second World War, probably, I am offended when I see sentences without capital letters, but I've got to grow up finally and just say, maybe it's not that important. What else we see in ground level detail? Healthiness was healthiness and wellness has been a kind of mega movement pre-COVID, and wellness meant perhaps some things like we get a bit more out of your meal and everything else. And I think the language of wellness has changed. I'm not particularly calling out Dorset cereals, but luscious apricots, juicy plums and pecans. I don't know if that really is healthy. Luxury tends to be one of the kind of aromas around the language of luxury is that it should be cold and inhuman. And I think that perhaps that hopefully is changing as well. That luxury brands can no longer seem to be elitist and aspirational and looking down on 99% of the world. I think naming needs to change. This is a US brand which changed its name, and there are still other cultural anchors in language which need to change. So a sister college, Imperial College, ditched its Latin motto, but retains the name Imperial College. We know, I mean, it's perhaps well rehearsed that nude isn't one color. Do any of you know the Conscious Style Guide? I think it's a very good service. They're compiling different conversations around language and how language is perhaps detrimental and how it's used and how we can use it better in various places. So I would always refer someone to spend some time looking at the Conscious Style Guide. So what's happening at ground level around other things? I think that formal grammar now looks corporate or maybe even looks elitist. So what would we ask some of our clients to do? when you look at the words and phrases you use and you don't use, and when you're looking at the grammar that you find acceptable, be careful about what assumptions you're bringing into the room in that moment. So really what's going on over on the right, as I said, the best advertising, the best copy has this sense of humanity. But I think there's something underlying this, which is the email that you might receive from the head of your organization, where they haven't really spent time to think very clearly about what it is they want to convey and do it in the most succinct way, even though they're one person communicating to 400. I think has elements of just being plain lazy or abusive even. I think in that middle area of the spectrum, where it's kind of, would you mind listening to us? We've got probably something you might find interesting to talk about. I think there's this sense of being submissive. And I think over towards the right, it's not just about humanity winning. I think over towards the right, the best stuff has this sense of collaboration. You want this, I want this. So let's just talk about it as peers. I posted something yesterday about transactional analysis and how that informs language. The transactional analysis, you must have talked about it. I don't know anything in linguistics, so you didn't teach me. From the 60s or 70s about interpersonal relationships. So again, humanity wins. Sorry, I'm going too fast. What can you do to make your brand language sound more human? Please, please don't define one of your tonal values as human, since which brand doesn't want to be human? If you are critiquing a piece of copy, perhaps human is a phrase that is easy to pull on because it's the opposite of corporate. But I think within that human, there's maybe what kind of human are you? What kind of human are they when they're constructing an identity about themselves? We build guidelines for businesses, and we build guidelines for organizations, and we build guidelines for all different kinds of groups of people who want to use language more effectively. And rather than using saying we will define your brand voice as human, friendly, warm, and approachable, we will go into quite a lot of detail, including, for example, with Vauxhall, what is humor? They said, we'd like to use British humor. We said, that's great. But British humor spans from Michael McIntyre to suddenly forgotten his name, Scottish comedian who is highly offensive. Thank you very much. There is a whole spectrum there. So what kind of humor do you want? British? Okay, what kind of British humor do you want? You want more Michael McIntyre, frankly. Tips. One of the best pieces of advice I ever heard was when you're writing, write like they're already walking away. Brilliant. Newspaper editors, by reputation, have this thing that when they're given an article, they will cross out the first paragraph and start reading from the second. If it makes sense reading from the start of the second paragraph, they don't need the first. So they'll cross out the second. If it still makes sense as a whole story reading from that paragraph, then you need to cross out, keep going. That's where you find the fastest way to start a piece of writing. Most people don't have time to read what you've sent them, what you're asking them to read. So write like they're already walking away is a great piece of advice. I would love to answer any questions now or subsequently. You can find me on email, chris@verbidentity.com, and I spend time on LinkedIn, perhaps too much time on LinkedIn. I am, if you look for Chris West Verb Identity on LinkedIn, you'll find me there. That's it. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that I covered some sense of how linguistics can play a role in industry, even if it's not directly called linguistics. An understanding of how language works is often a way of understanding how business works or how a relationship with a consumer works. And I hope that's given a bit of insight into that, as well as insight into the framework that we use and what we've seen changing over the last 2 or 3 years. Okay. Oh, round of applause. Round of applause. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much. I would love to answer some questions if you had questions.
Are you happy to take questions from hands up in the room, and I can propose any hands up online?
Absolutely.
So those of you who are watching online, just feel free to raise your hand. The technology seems to be working in terms of that we can hear you. So shall we start perhaps in the room?
Hello.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for that. That was really good. Very interesting.
Thank you.
I was just wondering about
I'm in fear now because you're going to ask me a really good linguistics question.
No, it's more about actually the brand you reference at Oatly and Brewdog, right? And talking about this move to be more purpose driven. But I wonder how they, like, not just those brands, but they are a good example, have had quite big scandals in the last 2 years themselves, and which go against what their public purpose is, right? How, like, it's a two-part question. Do you think that brand identity needs to be like inherently linked to actual inward purpose? And also, how do you think these brands should then own these mistakes and deal with that forward? Is it something they should talk about openly and that kind of stuff, or try and sort of move away from it?
Thank you. So if I paraphrase your question badly, let me know. But to the examples I mentioned, for example, Oatly and Brewdog, and you say quite rightly, they've had certain scandals attached to their names. And so although they're purpose-driven businesses, which seem to be for the greater good, they seem to have failed internally. So should a brand reflect what you truly are internally? And secondly, should they talk about it going forward? If that's correct, paraphrase your question. It's businesses will always say we do the right thing, and then they'll do the right thing up until the moment when there's something else that needs to be done instead. I think that they have failed if they failed to look after their people in a proper way. I don't think that it's necessarily a consequence of focusing on purpose. I think that probably in those businesses, it was a huge effort to get them to focus. In most businesses, it's a huge effort to get them to focus on a greater good. And that in itself was a good thing. And those other things are wrong, but I don't think that, I don't think that the brand owners could necessarily have understood what was, I'm not excusing them, I don't need to excuse them. The brand should reflect the truth of the business, because if it doesn't, it comes undone pretty quickly, as we've seen with, certainly with Brewdog and the scandal around that. So I would say fix your business before you fix your brand. Don't dress it up because it will get discovered very quickly. I do think businesses should talk about it. I do think they should own up on where they failed, because first of all, humanity wins. But I think people know that businesses are humans, and I don't think they will therefore excuse them. But I think that they will expect the humans to speak up and not be this idea of the impermeable four walls of a business is how businesses used to be. And no one understands that as a business metaphor now. I think instead what they understand is there are humans inside those walls. And so those humans need to act as humans and fess up. So I don't know if that was quite the answer I wanted to give. I'm not excusing anyone's bad behavior. I'm very clear on that. Thank you. Thank you for your question.
We've got a question online.
Yes.
Jim, do you want to go?
Hi, yeah, thank you, Chris. Just really quickly, is it possible to stop sharing your screen just so we can see you a bit better out here, outside?
How's that?
That's much better, thank you. All right, and yeah, it's something that I was interested in is about the ways that, just thinking about ways in changes to correspondence. So looking at some of the influence of COVID on the ways that we communicate particular things, do you feel, just thinking kind of, in a much bigger sense of communicating, I don't know, short ideas to each other, that we need to be kind of thinking more sensitively toward some of the messages to make sure that our own representation of our institutions is coming through in a way that shows that sensitivity?
Yeah, I mean, just the word institution in my mind conjures up this image of an unfeeling, unbending, rule-based organization. And certainly we don't want our institutions to be like that. So I would hope that the old sense of elitist authority, and therefore that's why I'm in charge, and therefore that's how I'm going to communicate to you, but a kind of top-down sense, even in that metaphor of hierarchy, higher and lower, I hope that language is not being used to reinforce that. And I hope that anyone that feels they are leading an organization can change their language so that it doesn't reinforce this top-down hierarchical metaphor. I think that out of interest, perhaps tangential to what you were asking there, is also that COVID legitimized space for people to talk about personal emotional issues. And they didn't all have to be related to COVID. They could also be related to, say, introversion and extroversion, or depression, or some of the other challenges that people find. And I think that what I've noticed in some professional communication is a much more overt ownership and declaration of the difficulties people experience, and that the fact that they're not automatons. So I don't know if that, hopefully the first part addresses your question. Hopefully the second thing I've said there kind of throws a light on the fact that I really hope that we can talk more openly and more considerately. And actually, when I'm saying, can you get back to me on this, I'm realizing that the phrasing of that is in itself putting a certain amount of pressure on the recipient. And so I'm trying to phrase it as, I won't be able to do it very well off the top of my head, but hopefully this is something that we can reach a decision on next week if you feel that you're, saying that's wordy, but hopefully it's giving space and consideration to the other person. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's perfect. Because I was thinking about the ways that we communicate particular, I don't know, demands, I guess. And I think that's the thing in terms of being representative of an institutional culture. It's hard to go back to that word, but I think there is something about being able to use that language consistently and kind of, I don't know, spread it out and use that as a kind of representative feeling, or collaborative or understanding language, inclusive language. Thank you.
No, you're welcome. There are certainly metaphors that operate in everything we say, and so institutions tend to reinforce those metaphors about, we do and you have to put up with. Other questions in the room? Yes, hello.
Thank you very much. My question is, it's a very fascinating talk and made me think about a lot about multilingualism, multimodality, and so on and so forth, and also the issue of creativity and innovation and that stuff. So my first question, if I may, is really about what do you see multilingualism, multiple language, different languages other than English, in brand language as a trend, or from your personal experience, how corporate engage with other languages in sending their brand images?
Thank you. So again, if I paraphrase your question incorrectly, please adjust what I'm saying. But your question is around multilingualism and how are brands embracing multilingualism and how are they using it? So 25 years ago, Audi relaunched their brand with the brand strapline Vorsprung durch Technik, which most people in Britain didn't understand because, as we know, most people in Britain can't speak German. But the fact that it was using German, and you could kind of guess Vorsprung, spring, I don't know, durch Technik, Technik sounds very technical. The whole phrase actually sounds very precise and technically perfect. They use they co-opted multilingualism, and someone else has done it recently as well. I think Miele, who make washing machines and a few other household appliances, they have co-opted German as a strapline. So I think perhaps a trivial answer to your question is brands will do what they can and they will bring in languages which have because of their associations with those other languages. Perhaps even open to accusations of racism. Why are you using German? What is it you're hoping to say about the German nationality or national tropes if you're using it? Most brands operate in multiple markets. What we would always say is this framework of creating a worldview, creating the personality, tonal values. Those things don't need to change when you move from country to country, because your brand is turning up the same in those different countries. And so it's not a massive rework of the guidelines when those guidelines land in Peru, for example. Perhaps what might change are the ground level details only. What are the jargon words you use? And I've had a long conversation when we were working on Adidas many years ago with the French account manager who said, oh, in French, we can't do sentences that short. So, okay, that's the discussion that we've had. So to answer your question, I think brands are aware, and they're not always doing the right thing, but they are aware of the role of multiple languages. I hope that helps.
We've got another question. question online, and then we can come back to the room. Nicola?
Hi, Chris. Thank you very much for that. That was really, really interesting. My question relates to your experience of working with the much larger multi-billion-dollar companies. And I just wonder, how successful are they generally in being able to kind of keep up and refresh that connection with their consumers and change their brand voice and tonal values as the years go by, those ones particularly that have been around much longer? Because it seems to me the kind of newer, you know, there's very much a move to newer artisan niche craft type businesses, which perhaps would be able to create those that good brand voice much more successfully. So, you know, how those much larger companies, how successful generally are they with keeping up that connection with their consumers?
It would be tempting to answer your question by saying the smaller the company is, the easier it finds it to update their language and be more current in their language.
Yeah.
I think probably the greater differentiation is which sector those companies find themselves in.
Mm-hmm.
So I find banks' language subtly patriarchal, and I'm not skilled enough to understand where that's coming from. I mean, I sense it, but I can't put my finger on it and say it's happening there. And it annoys me intensely. And the other sector which I see has language which is out of date is the car sector. And so BMW Germany launched a wonderful, you know, very exciting looking new 8 Series car. And they posted something about it on LinkedIn. It was in this kind of slightly urban landscape, but, you know, it might be a runway. And they had a woman in a long dress, long flowing dress, long legs, skirt slightly split up the leg, striding towards the car. And I was like, it's 2022. What on earth are you doing? What's the role of the woman in that ad? Right? So that industry, with one exception, that industry is quite outdated. The exception is Tesla, regardless of what we think of Elon Musk. I think he's a very skilled user and deployer of language. So briefly, 25 years ago, the only electric cars any of us would have known, the only electric vehicles any of us would have known, would probably have been a milk float and a golf cart. And so he was launching a sports car, which is his first car, a sports car. He was launching an electric sports car, right? That's a joke, because how fast can a go-kart go, and how fast, you know, a golf cart go, how fast can a milk float? But what he did was, I mean, you know, obviously wonderful engineering if you're into that kind of thing. But what he did was, he didn't just call the speed options in the car fast and very fast. Do you know what he called them? He called one of the speed options ludicrous. Right? So it kind of makes us laugh in this room, but it generated a lot of interest. And what we can sense when we hear that is, wow, that car is going to be kind of faster. I'm at least interested to know how fast it is. And so what he's done just by that choice of one word is get the conversation going in the right direction.
Mm.
The direction is how fast is this car going? So it's not really the size of the industry, which I think is, it's not really the size of the business, because Elon Musk's business by valuation, if not by number of people employed, you know, it's a very valuable company, but he's able to create a sense through language. But I also do acknowledge what you're saying, which is it tends to be the challengers in any industry. It's those new arrivals who can't outspend the incumbents. And so if you can't outspend, you've got to outthink.
Yeah.
If you're going to outthink, one of the tools you have is language. And you can really start a fight with language. So my book, which is called Strong Language, the subtitle is the fastest, smartest, cheapest marketing tool you're not using, because most companies aren't using language in a really smart way.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So my question is about, I have already know how language and working in branding, but when bringing the technology in consideration, maybe back we have the like only TVs or bus shelters, but now we have all kinds of platforms and technologies to be used, like the web pages and mini programs. So my question is, how to efficiently combine all this kind of tool and language in case of the upside down of priority? How to handle the relationship?
Okay, so let me check I've understood correctly if possible. So 25 years ago, it was quite simple to control language in a business because you maybe had posters and TV and press and that radio and that was it. You know, 25, 30 years ago. Now you have so many channels. I think there are two other issues, if I may say, that are interesting there. One is you do have more channels than you've ever had before. The second thing, which I think is critical, is that consumers expect to be in a relationship with brands that they like. And so it's no longer a monologue from the brand, it's actually the brand getting involved in a dialogue. So that's another consideration. And I think the third thing is there's an expectation that brands will be always on, always available. So for a brand owner, they have to communicate more channels more often than ever before. And so that is a challenge. We did a back of an envelope calculation where we were able to suggest that the marketing officer of even a medium-sized business is responsible for more words tomorrow than the editor of The Guardian will put in tomorrow's edition of The Guardian. Because when you add up what's going on in all of those channels, and it's language at the shop front, it's language at investor relations, it's language internally inside the building, then there's responsibility to get the language right because it is creating metaphors through the business. So to answer your question, it is very difficult. Excuse me, it is very difficult to control the language and make it consistent. Most choose not to do it. Most brand business owners would have really sweated the visual identity, the details on how we look, the photography, the color palette, the logo, and language seems like a liquid substance that just spreads out everywhere and you can't control it, can't control the shape. But however, many are now switching on to this idea that if you at least define the language on these three levels, then you are creating a set of guidelines, and then you can have a conversation with people about this is how we want our language to work. Does that answer? Okay, good. Hello.
Yep, go on, Dina, and then we'll go online.
Okay.
We'll go to two more questions online.
Okay, thank you very much. Really interesting.
Thank you.
I'm interested in your non-maneuver vignette. It seems to me that something like that actually will only backfire because you have there somebody who is representative of a teaching, of a worldview, using that in a very banal way. You know, I'm an atheist myself, but I think if I was a believer, it certainly put me off in terms of how the nun is really using that kind of worldview in a very banal way. So isn't that actually an example of how an ideology of worldview shouldn't be used?
Okay, so if I again paraphrase your question, then, and that hopefully for anyone that didn't pick it up remotely, is the danger that when you're very clear about what you stand against, you're very vocal about what you stand against, isn't there a danger that that will backfire? And so the nuns maneuver that example that it might put people off. Well, the first thing I'd say, to be slightly trivial, is the nuns don't care. You know, they've got a job to do, which is, in their eyes, to stand up, to bring people into a belief about God and keep them away from the devil. And that's very clear for them. So their language is maybe clarifying for the outside world, but it's also reinforcing within their organization. It's repeatedly reinforcing within their organization what do we stand for, what do we stand against. You know, so would it backfire for a commercial world? Very possibly. But at the same time, you know, when you think there are 115 million companies out there, and we have seen so many of them, and you and I have, you know, if you imagine your journey from home today to here, you've walked past so many billboards, you've walked past so many signs in this building, you've walked past so many ads on a taxi and everything else. Most of those don't get into our consciousness at all. So sometimes being quite stark can really cut through. And you might perhaps lose 10% of your potential audience along the way by being so stark about what you stand against. But I think along the way, as you lose those 10%, you might gain more people. And I think that's why Oatly has been so successful, because it's been really clear what it stands against and what it stands for. And I think that's helped it with a relatively low advertising spend to win lots of customers. But once they've won those customers, to really build a deep level of engagement with them, that those people feel really good, because I'm picking the oat milk brand, which is standing against the climate.
I see, we don't think that they're doing that in a very sophisticated way, but the man, to me, came as really analyzing her own ideology. So, a very, very different ends of saying what you stand against and using it in a particular context. So that is what the local authority. If they don't
No, the devil is anyone that stands. The devil is anyone that stands against the nurse, against the nun's good work. Yeah. But I mean, I do take your point. It does come across as banal, but for them, it's reinforcing.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Let's go to some questions online. I think Helena was first of the three hands.
Okay. Hello, Helena.
Hello, Chris, and thank you very much for your talk. One thing that really interested me in what you talked about the climate as an element of the corporate messaging. Climate responsibility and how an organization is acting to meet its responsibilities in that area is obviously particularly susceptible to sort of empty language. We've got this phrase greenwashing.
Yeah.
One thing that I've seen is when an organization that really brands itself, or even its main tenet is to be environmentally friendly and against greenwashing, is even they still sometimes seem to be susceptible to that kind of empty language. I saw one example today of an organization that was on the business section promoting itself, that was about verifying ethical and environmental credentials, and it said and it was saying very much against greenwashing and saying promises are not enough, and then went on in the very next sentence to say what pledges they make. Well, obviously pledges is a synonym for promises, so it's not the best use of branding there. What would you say about how to get hold of what is obviously a really multifaceted and complex issue, and to address that in your branding without obviously falling into that very trap of greenwashing?
Okay, so I think it's a very good question. If through some way you can find that example and send it to me, I would love to see it. If you send it to chris@verbalidentity.com, if you've got a photograph of it or something.
Absolutely, I'd love to.
Thank you very much. So I think, it's similar to the question that was asked here previously, which is, should brands be a truthful reflection of the business? And the answer is yes, because you get found out if you don't. And I think the answer really is as simple as that. I don't know why, if they're really saying those other people are just doing greenwashing, and I don't know why they have to elevate their own status by demeaning others. They should have the confidence, but also the actions internally, which make them a justifiable, a business which can justifiably claim to be aware of its impact. So I think that perhaps behind what we're talking about here is this idea that there are large cross currents in all communications, and a lot of businesses are being caught in a current now, which is we have to talk about sustainability, and the danger is that companies will just say it and not do anything about it. And I completely agree. And unfortunately, that's kind of beyond the remit of language, except perhaps with skills of linguistics and a company that's prepared to listen, you can say, look, you're using these metaphors, you're using these frameworks, you're using these narratives, and actually you're not doing anything about it. So, what are you going to do?
Thank you very much, Chris.
Pleasure.
I believe Claire was next online.
Hello, Claire.
Hi, beg your pardon. I'm Claire George. I lead marketing and communications at IOE. And I'm very grateful to Zsofia for inviting me and some of my team along today. It's been absolutely fascinating. And I've actually got a question that's perhaps more for the audience, but maybe you can help me with that, Chris. The IOE has a faculty brand, which we worked with academics to develop, which I understand Zsofia shared with you, Chris.
Yeah.
Part of that brand, it must encompass academic freedom, which is incredibly important, and the intellectual diversity that IOE represents. But academics do actually play a key role, obviously, in every kind of communication. They do, and they are frontline staff. They do a lot of that communication, and they actually also have a key role to play in writing the copy for our degree programs that promote them publicly. So the question is, we have the brand, it's on the intranet, and we've kept it reasonably low key because of really, I felt more confident in sharing it than I think would be the case in some other parts of academia, because I know, well, basically, because I've worked with academics here for a long time, and I know how open they are to this kind of conversation. But is it something that academics would be interested in talking about more directly? And I think it's the consistency that is both the key here, and that you've talked about, Chris, but also I think in academia it is a problem because of the sheer intellectual diversity that we represent. And we've chosen our brand values very carefully around that. So yeah, I'm interested in hearing how interested people are to talk about how that works in the ways they communicate.
Yeah, so it is a question for the room. And so as well as reflecting on your question, which is, how much do people want to embrace the brand values of IOE when they write? I'd also ask the question, how much do you think that doing that removes your own personality from the communications?
An interesting question. I think it also ties into the previous discussions we've had about to what extent the stated values and the stated tone of voice actually represents the reality. And I think academics, so I was making notes about, discomfort, certainly amongst some of us who look at institutional language, discomfort about essentially what we call capitalizing on social movement.
Yes.
For a business conference, for a business game. And some of that discomfort perhaps carries through, maybe in a justified way, maybe not, but it's certainly, I think, a conversation that needs to happen carefully. And it's not necessarily about academic freedom. It's more about, in particular, when it comes to representing our modules and prospectuses and things like that. I think we understand that's not us, that's the program.
Well, and also how much should you, as an academic, be instrumentalized in the furthering of the organization?
Yeah, so it's a really careful balance, and I think the conversation needs to be had in a way where we can voice those concerns as well. So that's my. There are no hands going up here, Claire.
Sorry, I actually can't really hear everything that you're saying. I think I got the gist of it, and that sounded that sounded absolutely right.
I mean, I'm very happy to have a conversation if you're interested.
Yeah.
No, I think it is an interesting conversation. I think it has an impact now, but it also has a theoretical impact. And I think, just as Zsofia is saying, which is as soon as you distill or try and represent the vastness of an organization in a few key words, you are by necessity throwing away some part of that organization and some things that people have put effort into and even invested their own identity in. So when you do that, you would inevitably have a conversation, and then you have a continuing conversation inevitably about, are those words a reflection of where we are, or are those words a reflection of where we want to be? And if it's the latter, is that legitimate? You know, that's to be answered in the discussion. But I think also there's a question about how much freedom is there for an individual to speak exactly as they want? Well, in theory, that should be all the time. But how much is that person's platform due to the organization that is encompassing them? And so therefore, what's the quid pro quo that should be recognized? So I think it is a worthy discussion. And, you know, in the end, what's the point of creating the tonal values? What's the point of creating the tone of voice guidelines is my question. What did you hope to achieve? And then you can say to how far towards that goal are those tone of voice guidelines taking?
Yeah, and for us, it's really, I mean, it's about representing. We use it technically ourselves because we need to represent an organisation that is unbelievably popular to people who don't know us. And for that, we have to make things clear and simple and engaging and attractive and all those kinds of things. And the status quo is that people write what they write. And so we have absolute, you know, basically that's the status quo is that there is absolutely no imposition of anything in terms of what language is used, really. We focus really on accuracy rather than anything else. And so anything that, it's really kind of a matter of just kind of consistency of tone that we could explore or not.
Yeah.
And alternatively, it can be just use that as a wraparound in terms of the things that we write, and it could continue like that. The question is whether it can, you know, whether it can go any further down. And I think the answer, well, maybe no. But that puts universities in a particular situation.
Yes, to be continued, this discussion to be continued.
Yeah.
One more hand.
Definitely, yes. Mohammed, I think your next and perhaps I'm looking at the time. That's
Yes, yeah, because I know you have other things to do.
So thank you, Chris, for the presentation. I just wonder if you are welcome to share that with the attendees so that we can contact you via email.
I lost some of that, but yes, my email is chris@verbalidentity.com.
I have tried that myself, but it was not responsive. I mean, that the email is not that correct, I think, for me, because I couldn't write you through that email. Just if you want to share the presentation with us.
We will. So Chris kindly allowed us to record this, so we will be sharing it on our usual YouTube channel.
Great.
Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. So could you please indicate to the channel?
How did you find us? We'll be sharing it on Twitter. We'll be sharing it on YouTube. I can certainly send a link to everyone who is registered for the Zoom call. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Oh, and there he is as well.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's right there, unless anyone's got anything burning to ask. Thank you very much. And I hope that you found it in some ways insightful. I've enjoyed talking and answering your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for being here remotely. Thank you most for Zsofia, for the guidance you've given me over a number of years and for inviting me back in to talk about what I've learned along the way. Thank you, Zsofia.
Thank you for coming.